Good evening and welcome. I am extremely pleased to see the lecture hall actually full. My name is Maria Giudici and I coordinate the PhD program, and I have the pleasure of editing EA files. That is the EA's Journal of Record. So first of all, I want to thank obviously our guest tonight, Sébastien Marot, who is going to present the re-edition of his book, first published by the EA in 2003. And then, obviously, also Iris Hansen, who will be with us for the conversation. Georges Descombes, unfortunately, cannot join us today for health problems, but is very much with us in spirit. First of all, I would like to thank, obviously, the school for republishing the book and hosting this conversation. So, obviously, starting from our director, Ingrid Schroeder, and the head of our comms studio, Ryan Dillon. And I would also like to thank the people who worked on the reedition of the book, starting from George Houghton, the graphic designer, who gave us, in fact, actually the graphic design of the reedition of the book, guided and curated, of course, by the then head of design, Sasha Loebe. We had an amazing editorial team, Christina Rapatsky, Annalisa Reynolds, Max Zarzicki, who were part of the editorial team, of course, for this reedition. But obviously, this is a re-edition of a book that the EA first published now 21 years ago. And so I am guessing that you are familiar with our guests of tonight, but if you're not, I'm going to just give you a brief biographical note. Obviously, Sébastien is a teacher and historian who specializes in architectural theory. And interestingly enough, actually, he was educated in philosophy originally, and then he holds a PhD in history from the School of Haute Etudes in social sciences, in fact, right? And then obviously he had an extensive career as a researcher, teacher, and writer. He most recently actually curated in 2019 the exhibition Taking the Countryside that was part of the Lisbon's Architecture Triennial, and then traveled in many different cities, most recently in Grenoble and Nantes, but also including Lyon, Lausanne, Brussels, where we had the pleasure actually of having it at the Saint-Géry actually space. And that is now actually the root of this recently published book, for the moment just existing in French, but that I very warmly actually recommend to all of the people interested in Sébastien's work. He is obviously also a teacher, I think a very, very important teacher for a whole generation of architects, landscape designers, and scholars. He teaches actually today history and theory. He's a professor of history and theory of the environment at the School of Architecture in Paris-Est. I have to say that I really love the fact that it's history and theory of the environment, not just architecture, this expanded field. And also visiting professor at the EPFL in Lausanne and Harvard GSD. Obviously, Sébastien has taught throughout his career in many schools beyond the schools that I just mentioned, most notably Geneva, Harvard, Cornell, UPenn, and the EA. The EA, where in fact actually the trajectory of this book started with a series of seminars in the late 90s that probably took place in this very room, more or less, next door, in the North Jury room then. And then evolved through a series of conversations, publications. First of all, in Le Visiteur, there was this incredibly important journal that he founded and directed from 1995 to 2010. And then subsequently in the EA's edition in 2003, and then in a first French edition in 2004, and eventually then republished in a French edition in 2010, that became then the book for much of the iconographic work that the EA team then did to republish a second edition, in fact, of the book just this year, essentially. Le Visiteur has been incredibly influential and important, but it also has to be underlined the fact that Sébastien is now the editor of Marne, Documents of Architecture. That is a journal that he's been editing since 2010. He is obviously the editor and author of several books. Obviously this, obviously the new book actually on Taking the Countryside in French that I just showed you, but also The City and the City, Berlin, a Green Archipelago, published by Lars Muller in 2013. So obviously there is a red thread that runs through all of your work that I think is very well synthesized, in fact, by the book. But before moving to the book, actually, I also want to introduce our guest of tonight, Iris Hansen, who is a recent graduate from the EA and Cardiff University in 2020. She's the founder of Studio Hyde. Her work centers on ruralism, convivial placemaking, which I find a really beautiful definition to address your architecture, and sustainable material culture, with a strong focus on the relationship between landscapes and people and craftsmanship. So I think, in a way, a kind of triangle of interest that chimes very well with Sebastien's work. And through Hyde, actually, Iris explores local knowledge of materials and the relationship to place, such as wood, glass, and wax, collaborated with artisans like glass blowers, for instance, foresters, and even beekeepers. Hopefully you're going to get to tell us a little bit more about that maybe in the conversation. Iris advocates for a practice that is really deeply rooted in place, and she aims to reconnect people with their landscapes through design and narrative building. So I think a profile that definitely sounds inspired by the work of people like Sébastien, who set up almost like a new agenda for architects and landscape designers actually to operate in. And I know that definitely a lot of the people who are in the room today have probably been influenced or have had their life changed actually by your work, including me, I have to say. I'm going to leave you with the floor in a second so that you can, tell us about the book in your own words. I hope that most of you have read the book or are familiar with the book, but the book is described by the author himself as a kind of like an interlocking of stories, right? That goes through 4 chapters from the present from the past to the present, from the scale of architecture to the scale of the city to the scale of the territory. So there is almost like a beautiful architecture behind these 4 episodes that one can read as separate episodes, but in fact as points of the same red thread. A red thread in the new note that you added to this new edition, you show us to be connected in a larger, more profound way to your research in general. For instance, you tell us that in fact actually this should be a chapter of the broader research that you put forward with Palimpsestos Ithaca, a possible book that will come one day, and it has as a subtitle, A Relative Manifesto for Suburbanism. I think your titles are really beautiful, and hopefully this is going to be part of the conversation too. We can unpack perhaps a little bit what you mean by relative manifesto. But of course, when the book first appeared in 2003, it was meant to be, in a way, a response to what you call super-urbanism, right? So the urbanism where program becomes the site itself, that you most notably identify with the work of Rem Koolhaas. I have to say that for people who are coming of age in 2003, like me, this was almost like a shock to the system, right? Because we were trained, we had grown up in the tradition, by then a tradition, in fact, actually, of super-urbanism, and then reading for the first time an author that took such a different approach, where on the contrary, site and context would be at the center of the question rather than program, was what also yourself you call in the book an antidote somehow to that way of thinking that seems increasingly difficult to be used. I mean, it seems increasingly difficult to use actually that framework of superurbanism as something productive to deal with the contemporary condition. And on the contrary, actually what you call suburbanism, which is, again, a wonderful word that has so many layered meanings, actually, in the book, seemed exactly, actually, what the generation that was coming of age at that point needed to start rethinking the future in an interesting way. And I think the whole book has this very interesting relationship and play between what is past and what is present, what you also address in your note as the relationship between the art of memory and the art of hope. And I think I actually want to thank you for having written that book because it's been so meaningful and significant to those who were looking for an alternative to superurbanism, which obviously is an attitude that is incredibly fertile and interesting and important, but at a certain moment needed a response. So to me, this book was that response. And so it's actually very exciting to have you here today with us, to tell us a little bit about actually these 20 years afterwards, what changed, what stayed the same, what evolved along the way. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much for your introduction. Yes, I brought a few images because you said you expect or you hope that people have read this book, but it was actually unavailable for many years. is just out again, and I'm very happy that the Architectural Association actually did republish it today. But I hope, but I do not expect everybody to have read this book. So I brought a few images. Georges was not here, and we are not going to have that conversation with him. I thought maybe it's good to, just show what it's about, As you said, the Architectural Association is important for this book, because it was actually, for a seminar that I was giving, I think it was 97. I remember that because my first daughter was just born. We couldn't sleep, and it was horrible. And I remember very well a night before coming here, where I had announced the topic of the memory and landscape architecture, and I was like, what am I going to say? So it's really like that. It happened. And I kind of hastily gathered things, that meant something for me, that I thought were close to that subject or topic, but and put them together, and then took the Eurostar. And actually the book is made of those elements that I hastily gathered that night in a kind of fever of anxiousness, But then while giving the seminar, I felt in a way more and more interested by the superimposition of those different stories, in the double meaning of the word stories. So then I worked very much on that things, and it became an essay published in Le Visiteur, this magazine first, this journal, and then it became these books you mentioned. That now it's this one, and so it all started from another little essay that I had published in the first issue of Le Visiteur, called Landscape as Alternative, where I tried exactly to define, where I came up with this concept of sub-urbanism, to describe a kind of alternative poetics of design to super-urbanism that was kind of active, I thought, in the field of landscape design at that time. I remember Jacques Lucan wrote a piece one day, a very short piece, where he was very nervous about landscape architects coming into the scene, being vocal in urbanism. Who were these guys? Nobody knew them anyway. So why was that so interesting? And he, I remember, wrote in this little piece, where, we understand why. We understand why. They are not expensive, unlike architects, They have manipulite, They were not into the wars and reconstruction, the grands ensembles, which is not true, by the way. They were there too. And that I found it very nasty. He said, and they are very useful because they have no idea on the city. I thought that's interesting. So, and I wrote in a way this text, Landscape as Alternative, as a kind of extensive reply to Jacques, to say, let's say that what's happening with the alternative of landscape architecture in the field of urbanism is a kind of switch of poetics, where you could say that in architecture, I'm very, very grossly saying things, that you basically go from program to site. That program is absolutely, you have to have a program to have a building anyway, whether it's written or not, but it's programmatically determined. In landscape architecture, you see that it's a bit different. You don't have a program of a garden. you have usually a site and you're making a garden out of it, etc. So I would say that in landscape architecture, because of the way things you go rather from site to program than the other way around. So just that is kind of interesting. There is a different hierarchy between site and programs in the modes of production of those two things. Of course, it's not to say that every architecture is programmatically determined. Of course, you could show me many, many examples where the dialectics between the two is much more interesting, etc. But grossly speaking, it's like that. So what happens in the field of urbanism, and what I was sensing is that there was those landscape architects, a few of them actually, were bringing that kind of poetics of different process or hierarchy between site and program in the field of urbanism. And I thought it was interesting, and that we should, in a way, someday write a manifesto for that approach. And in that sense, it was indeed completely the reverse of what I called super-urbanism, which is a poetic, a great one in some way, that tries to invent literally the site through the program. Right? But that's too much. And in this little essay that I had written, I was kind of delineating what seemed to me to be the essential characteristic reflexes or precepts of a suburbanist approach to site planning and design, in a way. And I don't know if it's true, but I describe that as a kind of provisional ethics for suburbanism. So an interest for the memory of sites, what is there, how it could be conveyed, redefined through the design. An in-depth reading or volumetric reading of open spaces. They are not that you cannot describe just with a plan. It's volumetric from the lithosphere to the atmosphere. There is several layers there. A relational thinking that sees sites not just as a collection of entities or objects, but as a network of relationships between those things. And finally, a kind of dynamic, yes, or processual understanding of what a site is. A site cannot be understood by a photography at a time t. It's a metabolism. It's in linear and circular time, etc. So you can very well see that in landscape architecture, obviously all these things are almost natural, and bringing that into the field of urbanism seemed to be important. So very simply, I said, okay, I'm going to write an essay on each one of those, right? And I start by the first one, memory, right? And this is the book that I did. I thought then that I would write another essay on each of those, but I didn't do it. I didn't do it, not just out of laziness, even though I have very, very good theoretical arguments for laziness, but also because doing this, then it changed my view, and I'll say a few words in the end of what I maybe will do there. Okay, so that was the text, etc. Okay. Well, no, I'm going backward. Sorry. Okay. So the book, those 3-4 stories that I put together. One is to explain my amazement when I read Frances Yates' book. Frances Yates actually gave a lecture here in 1997. I was not there. It was published in the A.A. Quarterly, where she was trying to explain to architects what lessons they might draw from her incredible inquiry into how the art of memory functioned in ancient, with the ancients, in classical Rome and before in Greece, etc. So you probably know, I'm not going to go, but she was the first to really describe how people will train their memory when they didn't have prostheses, books, paper, laptops, and everything, So you had to, memory was an art. Memory was something very fragile, very volatile. And you had to cultivate art. And there were techniques that she described very well in this, and particularly, centrally, techniques that involved mental architecture and mental imaging or painting. So that, someone who was to give a lecture would, in fact, register in his mind, in a palace of memory that he had carefully, thought, where he had carefully painted and placed images that would remind him, all the arguments and even the words that he wanted to use, etc. And so giving a lecture, it's like meandering in a building and etc. So incredible, that stuff. And so the book is extraordinary because she also explained how that art of memory evolved and was marginalized, after Gutenberg, and when we started to have the libraries and books and etc. That was not, used that much. But how also it migrated in certain areas, and notably in gardens, right? In the art of gardens. So it was important because it could be cities, not only palaces, memory. So, it's fantastic when you analyze paintings of these days, because they had also a kind of iconographic memorial signification. And buildings, Panofsky described how, the Gothic cathedral was kind of summa theologia built in a way. People couldn't read books, but they could read buildings. It was a memory place. It's Victor Hugo in, this will kill that. The printed book will kill the built book in a way. So it was marginalized and it migrated, obviously, notably in landscape design, garden design, where theaters of memory, landed in a way in gardens. And this is interesting to relate to the theory of the three natures, that John Dixon Hunt explained very well in The Humanist. His thesis is to say that the description of the garden as a third nature was that the garden was, for the humanists, a kind of emblematic representation and model of the landscapes beyond. The wilderness in the background, in a way, the saltus, and the ager, and the agriculture. So in the garden, you would find emblems of all the elements there, and hence it would transform the background into a landscape. It would make it readable in a way. So the garden was an art of representation. Maybe this disappeared with the picturesque when it started to melt in a way. Sorry. Anyway, you know that. So a garden was a way of organizing the meeting of a topic, for instance, love, and all the feelings related to love and indifference, onto a topography, right? So it could be like that, or it could be like Versailles, right? To organize the garden as a model of the sovereignty of the kingdom, a model of the way the territory was to be organized also. So, of course, after that the art of memory left the art of garden, but not completely. So that was my first element. It was a charade. My first was The Art of Memory by Frances Yates. My second was 2 or 3 pages from Civilization and Its Discontent by Sigmund Freud. It's a book in 1930, I think, or 31, where Freud was not, he didn't go to the meetings of the Society of Psychoanalysis any longer. And he wrote to Lou Andreas Salome, I write books because I can't smoke and play card all day, and in a way. So, and in that book, at some point he explains that his thesis is that memory, in a way, is like a pyramid that stocks everything you went through, right? And that provided a kind of regression and etc., you can find back everything, right? And he used a metaphor to explain that. He said, it's like when you go to Rome, right? Rome of today, you can find traces of all the different, walls that limited the city. So very few for the first one, more of the others, etc. And he said, this is the way the past is kept in the city as fragments. But if you want to approach, he said, I would say the 4-dimensionality of the psyche, you would have to imagine a 4-dimensional Rome, where every, it would not be exactly like that. Every building that occupied a given site would be simultaneously present with the others. Right. So maybe with a kind of program today you could navigate into these things. But for him it was like that. And so he has 2 or 3 pages completely mad where he describes a 4-dimensional Rome. But then at the end he has a kind of hesitation and it said, well, maybe the psyche is a bit, in fact, like the real city. Maybe there have been traumas that have, obfuscated the past here or there. And maybe the task of psychoanalysis, in a way, is to unravel, those things. So there is a very interesting approach there. And at about the same time, there was a sociologist, Maurice Halbwachs, who wrote fantastic text on what he called the social frameworks of memory. For him, as a sociologist, the seat of memory was not the psyche, it was society. A society. Memory would function, of course, with personal bricks, of memories, but that each individual engages in social frameworks of memory, without which there would be no memory. So I can't go into that, but it's a fantastic inquiry, and he criticizes Freud for his too psychological conception of memory, and he uses also the image of Rome and Roman buildings, where in those buildings you have engaged stones from a preceding one. So these are the equivalent of individual memory, but they are engaged in a new collective in a way. Anyway, and he wrote that beautiful sentence: the place occupied by a group is not like a blackboard on which you write and then erase numbers and figures, right, etc. Okay. And also, in a certain tradition of landscape painting and landscape architecture, especially in the picturesque tradition, you see those time travel machines, gardens that are organized to encourage, stimulate a kind of time travel. Even in the Haussmannian, when the city is commodified, into the present, right? You have les buttes Chaumont, or you have here les buttes Chaumont, that are explicitly or implicitly organized as a place where you escape that kind of flat flattening of time, right? And okay. And later, for instance, the Situationists International, with their psychogeography or drifting, the art of drifting in the city, would equate in a way the city or the metropolis to a cosmopolis, right? Where fragments of all, mindsets and of the world are simultaneously present, and you travel there. And actually, if you look at Guy Debord's map, psychogeographic map of Paris, it's called Discours sur les passions de l'amour, and it's a commentary on Madeleine de Scudéry's map that I showed before, which he knew very well. Okay. And here is a very rare photo of Guy Debord in front of a suburban landscape of Paris. My third element is Robert Smithson, who was a suburban, but which you see in front of the Colosseum here, central Rome. He often came back to that exhibition that he gave, his first exhibition in Rome in 1960 or 61. And he said it was absolutely an incredible experience for him. He said, my encounter with European history as a nightmare, And he was reading Civilization and his content. Freud he was devouring Freud at the time. And he is exactly giving the same kind of description of Rome that Freud gives in there. And then he said, I had to leave that. Nightmare and go become an American artist, meaning coming to terms with America, suburbia, of which he was from. And from, 1965 and 66, he starts, as you all know, his sightseeing experience. But he writes sight, not S-I-T-E, sight probing in a way. So the artist is a sightseer, and he goes into these New Jersey abandoned land quarries, car cemeteries or everything. And that comes very, very well into his fantastic text, A Tour to the Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, where he portrays himself as a kind of Martian, landing after a bus ride there, landing in a desert landscape along the river Passaic, completely transformed then by construction of a highway there. And he describes what he calls the monuments of Passaic, the bridge monument, a rotating bridge on the thing, just a photo like that, the fountain monument, bird eye view, side view, as if he was, Israel Sylvestre engraving Versailles garden, or the Great Pipe Monument, which he describes as ruins in reverse, right? Not building that fall into ruin after being built, but building that raise into ruin in a way before there. And he has that sentence, he says, very weird. Has Passaic replaced Rome as the eternal city? If certain cities of the world were placed end to end in a straight line according to size, starting with Rome, where would Passaic be in that impossible progression? And he replied, he gives the answer, each city would be a three-dimensional mirror that would reflect the next city into existence. The limits of eternity seem to contain such nefarious ideas. And the whole tour of the monuments ends, on this last of the monument, the sandbox monument, also called the desert monument, where he develops a kind of proof of entropy, of the entropy that the world is condemned to, in a way. Okay. What he doesn't say in the whole text is that he's not a Martian going into that place. In fact, he's going to his birthplace, right? So he took other photos that he didn't publish, and he knew what he was talking about. Passaic boys are hell, because he lives all his teenage, and in Passaic, where his father had built for him a kind of suburban basement museum. That's the expression that he uses, suburban basement museum, where he had his fossils. He was mad of geology and everything, paleontology, and had his first, paintings there. In another interview, he explains that in fact, not only he was in his teens there, but he was born there at the hospital of Passaic. And so, but that's important. Why? Because of the pediatrists that actually gave him birth, right? Or extracted him. Delivered, exactly. Delivered the guy. This guy was William Carlos Williams, the doctor, but also this great poet, the master of the counterculture after that, who devoted himself an enormous book to Patterson. He was exactly working there as a pediatrist and a doctor. And Patterson is both the name of a doctor, who is the hero of, in a way, the book, and the name of the city of Patterson, which is actually there. So it's both a mind, psyche, and a city. Yeah, that's what he writes. No ideas, but in things. Only the local is universal. And Smithson says that his piece on Passaic was absolutely a contribution to William Carlos Williams' affair. Then we all know that Smithson embarked into a very short but very intense journey, first doing, after that, what he called non-sites. He actually wrote a theory, a provisional theory of non-site, describing a non-site as a three-dimensional logical picture of a site. And he explains what he means by that. Three-dimensional, that's clear. Logical means not mimetic, but abstract. So it's a picture of something, but an abstract picture of that thing. Usually, you can have two-dimensional logical picture of something. For instance, the plan of a building. Doesn't look like the building, right? But it nevertheless represents it. So you could discuss on what means. Okay, so, but what would be a three-dimensional, logical, abstract picture of something? It's a bit like a three-dimensional mirror. Bizarre idea. So it's that, installations that are meant to represent a site, usually suburban, etc., in the Central Gallery in central New York, for instance. Right? Very quickly after that, he does that for a year. Then he does interventions directly on site, mimicking entropy or revealing entropy in a way, like here also, and then leads to more complex things, like such as spiral jetty, which is both this construction of this bizarre jetty, mimicking the crystal construction of salt, formation of salt, crystal salt, etc. But also a movie which is made of the construction of the jetty, and that movie was meant to be shown in a cinema cavern dug at the foot of the jetty. So you see the thing, it's you could say that there is the site and the non-site, the film and the thing, but it's a non-site built on site with the matter of the site. So it's a logical, three-dimensional, logical picture of a site built on the site itself, which is, to me, a perfect rediscovery of the concept of third nature. Right. Conceptual, it doesn't mimic, right? But it represents nevertheless the stuff. Okay, except that situations have changed, anthropic landscapes. Okay, now my last element of the charade was this little garden that Georges Descombes, and I'm really sorry that he's not here tonight, that Georges Descombes did in the late 70s, early 80s, just by Geneva, in a place he came from, also as a kid, like Smithson with Passaic. So we are very close to Geneva, in a kind of marshy area, right? That was in the 1930s completely drained, to make a productive vegetable production there. And so there was a complete transformation from that situation to this one, where it became, yes, a very productive thing. So Georges was born in one of those houses there. And so this rectification with canal civil engineering has left many traces on the spot. And Georges was born, yes, just there. And when, he was at the Architectural Association after Geneva, he studied 1 or 2 years here, I think. And then he came back later to teach there. And he had the opportunity to work exactly on that spot. So you have a very little brook that goes to the Voiret, that goes to the Aire, where he recently did another, in the 2 past decades, another very important project. But he started on this little brook that was colonized in the 60s and 70s by collective buildings. So here is a photo of Georges with his mother, just emerging from the oceanic feeling there. And there was an adventure playground there. And so the municipality had decided to enlarge, double the width of that road. And the thing that he did with his students, and made the municipality accept that project, was to build this tunnel bridge. So a very simple corrugated steel hole in the, how do you call that? The embankment, exactly. So to pierce very simply the thing. And then a 100-meter footpath shot into that tunnel to explain that at the same time that you are crossing the road, you are also crossing the little brook, which is on one side of the thing and the other side there, right? The brook is there, and then it's there, right? So a kind of explicitation, right, of what is happening there that tries to help the brook sustain the fight with the road, in a way, right? To eloquently say it's there, and to give the brook also a depth, a thickness, right? So that everybody sees it there. Okay, and then the park was organized as several little interventions like that. So a bridge, discreet, there is no, anyway, I don't. You will read it anyway, and you see the materials that it uses. Doesn't it recall you something? Then another, then they completed the little garden with 3 old orchards that were transformed into a little public park, and they just did a few interventions on the lines that separated the orchard plots there, just giving them certain depth. Here one with a canalization that brings the water of the brook, which is down the thing up, and which is articulated to a sound box also that looks a bit like the one that Herzberger or Aldo Van Eyck did for the Montessori schools. He was very close to those guys, which looks like the foundation of a house that was there or the ruin of that house. So it's between construction site and ruin in a way. It recalls me the installation there on Bedford Square there. So yeah, and doing all these things with very simple civil engineering things, for canalization, for instance. So concrete blocks, it's very Doric relationship to the ground. If you want to make a pergola, very simple. You take one of those glass houses in that new irrigated drain plane and strip it of its plastic thing, and you have a pergola. So it's also a representation in that sense of the ingredients that have built the thing. A few Doric steps up to a tree there, etc. You see the logic of it. Sometime giving a kind of three-dimensional existence to, how do you call that, a contour line, to dramatize in a way the inflection in the ground. And he worked very closely, and if he had been here tonight, he would have insisted on that. He worked very closely with his dear friend Alain Léveillé, who just died recently, a cartographer who superimposed different chronologic maps of different times and produced maps out of that superimposition, noting permanence, disappearance, but also persistence in between. So in a way, he became a cartographer working on that garden, and Georges became a landscape architect from the architect he was by working there. Well, I won't say much more on this, except that when I started to write on that, to make that essay, this charade into a book, there is no conclusion to my charade, you see. Into a book, I worked very hard. And at some point, I read William Carlos Williams, and I read all William, and especially his autobiography, A Voyage to Pagany, in which he says that when he was 13, his mother took them with his brother to Europe for a year. Not to Europe, to Switzerland. Not to Switzerland, to Geneva. Not to Geneva, to Lancy. And there are descriptions by William Carlos Williams of the site of that where Georges Descombes would do his garden. So what I tell the students is, be fair or be true to your paranoia. You will be always rewarded. And I went to Yale, to the Beinecke Library, where there is the fund. So looking at the William Carlos Williams archives, because he said, Mama took a photo of that. I found a photo of the bridge, and I found a photo of William Carlos Williams with the brook of the Voie just behind the thing. So let's imagine, if all the suburbs of the world were, put in line, side by side, starting with Passaic, where would be Lancy? Each suburb would be a three-dimensional mirror, etc. You see, that's it. And yeah, and so maybe just 2 words after that. So I started to think, in fact, it shouldn't be one pillar of a quartet of essay on the principles of suburbanism. It should be the first part of a diptych, or maybe a triptych, on time. So memory on the one side, the art of memory, or design as an art of memory, but also design as an art of hope. Because if memory, when the ancient made it, took it as a matter of art, because it was not something that was given memory. You had to really cultivate your memory to have one, right? Today, I think we have many, many prostheses, full banks full of memory. But the banks of hope are like broke. And I think, so now hope has to become a matter of art. You cannot just say, I'm optimist or pessimist. It's both complacency. It's a matter of art. It's a matter, you have to cultivate hope. So anyway, but for a while I did something else. I tried to write a relative manifesto for suburbanism by choosing Cornell, the site of Cornell, to look at the parallel stories of many people that I'm really interested in that project, who happened, all of them, to go at Cornell and do something at some point quite important. Smithson, for instance, Mata Clark, Colin Rowe, Ungers, Colas, etc. Colas, who started his project on New York there because of Ungers, etc. And to take the place where all these guys, Colin Rowe, Ungers, and Colas, did their metropolitan manifestos on Berlin, New York, or Rome for Colin Rowe, while they were all in that little tree city, there. So choosing that place and Nabokov, and using for that the method de Marcel Duchamp. I love this sentence by Nabokov. If parallel lines do not meet, it is not because meet they cannot, but because they have other things to do. You can make them meet if you're very attentive. And then the other reason why I didn't write those essays on in-depth reading, etc., this is at least what I say to myself now, it's because they were already written. They have been already written by super good designers. Particularly this guy, David Holmgren, the co-founder of the concept of permaculture. In this book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, that I strongly recommend, and that led me in many ways to do that big exhibition on the relationship between agriculture and architecture along the story, which is a way of nurturing that book that I'll write on the art of hope, since agriculture has a lot to do with the art of hoping. So that's the new book. The English edition is out of print now for a long time, so I'm looking for a new publisher in English for the augmented version of that book. And I leave you with these this viatic of little sentences that help me a lot. So that I've been too long, huh? But no?
There is actually.
Okay. So that's what the book is about. And this little book is still very dear to my heart. Because it started the whole delirium.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredibly generous cross-section through the book and through your thought process and how that evolved. It was really lovely also to see you put it in context of what you did then afterwards. I was wondering if you have like a first reaction or something actually that you wanted to add.
Well, I think it's quite funny because this book was pretty central to your coming of age in architecture and so on. Mine of yours was the Taking the Countryside. But for the occasion of tonight, I got to read this book. And so it was the second coup. I was like, well, again. Because your book provides a really like compelling case as to like the shift how we design. So as you explain, we move away from the traditional sort of like program to site, and we go the other way around. So it's the site that then decides the program or shapes it. And I think just the way in which that kind of shifts everything and how we design was really compelling, especially now when we kind of, the world is not as easy, I guess, as before. And actually the sentence, at the end, the century of expanding cities has passed, as is now the time of deepening territories. Exactly. I think really resonates probably with all of us who are kind of becoming architects, and now like that's the mission. So I think it's just really well explained with examples, and it starts with a thesis, then we go through those 4 chapters, and then it ends with pretty almost political calling as to, do that, and that's pretty great. So thank you.
In a way, thank you very much. It's exactly what it's meant to be. So I don't wish it. But actually, the book on agriculture and architecture, we added something on that tried to prolong, in a way, this idea that our century is not that of extending cities, but rather of deepening territories, in a way. And in a way more literally, by making a plea for urban exodus, at least to try decipher this hopefully of the end of the dynamics that has been with us for 3 centuries or more, of the rural exodus, of the draining of both population and resources to the cities, right? Of this metabolic rift, to speak like Marx, and that we badly need now. I mean, in a way, you cannot go further. In the eradication of the countryside, and that we badly have to go the other way around.
It's quite interesting, actually, that you highlighted that sentence. That is the second to last before to extrapolate. The sentence on extrapolation is basically the end of the book, this idea of deepening territories, because I had also highlighted that for a possible discussion, because it triggers a lot of ideas on the topic of thickness that comes back several times actually throughout the book, and it links for me with another topic that is also evident in your research on Ithaca, this idea of the palimpsest, of the reading of the palimpsest, or the palimpsest as a possible model for the understanding of the real. So I was wondering actually if you have something to add on that question of the palimpsest that then would become more evident perhaps in the work of Ithaca, but it is already there in the original book, linked to another question that also is woven in the book here and there, the question of the map. So the question of the difficulty of translating a palimpsest, in fact, into a map, or almost impossibility perhaps actually to do so. Because I think that is a question that triggers a little bit actually the limits of our discipline as architects and our means that are very often means that are very bidimensional, almost literally, of course, in the case of maps, and don't always help us necessarily deal with this kind of deepening or thickening that you are discussing in your books.
Maps, Why permaculturists do not use maps? That's an interesting question to ask. Actually, there is another question which is maybe in some way linked to it. There is a big mystery about Le Nôtre, the absence of drawings of Le Nôtre. So you have like 2 theses. They are missing. We don't know where they are, right? But there is the other theory that it was not that important. It was not that important. It was measurement. It was, I don't know exactly. It was survey, that's for sure. But no. So permaculturists, very, very few use maps. It's a question for us.
I think it's wonderful, this question of Le Nôtre and of the missing, quote-unquote, drawings that I was not aware of. But having research actually on my side, Haussmann, there's also a mystery there, because we actually don't have almost any visual evidence of what they did in that office when they were deciding actually to carve a boulevard or to cut something.
Really?
And in his memoir, actually, he describes a map that apparently he had in his office atelier with different systems in different colors, but no evidence of this drawing has been uncovered, or at least there isn't something solid. So there's obviously actually drawings post facto, propaganda drawings, if you want, actually of the achievements, in fact, of his tenure, but not necessarily drawings that were projecting. And in fact, in a lot of moments in his memoir, he even says that some decisions were taken on site. On site, again, with this kind of double entendre of the site as the sense of sight and the site, sometimes literally looking at alignments. So it's to me, this is interesting because it kind of, it's again another way of breaking through that artificial division between the architecture of the landscape and the architecture of the city. That are, in fact, very much two things that are intertwined. And you started actually by telling us your debate in a way with Jacques Lucan about the idea that landscape architects don't understand the city and they have clean hands. Well, in fact, I completely agree with you. It's completely the opposite. Landscape architecture was in there all along in the making, especially of the 20th century city. So I was wondering if you feel like unfolding a little bit actually what you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about the Grand Ensemble and in fact the role.
Of course, landscape architects, at least in France situation that I know better, many were completely involved in the things, except that they were the last wagon of the train, and that often they didn't do anything. But they were involved in all these things. No, I think, in a way, there is some truth to what Lucan said. That, I mean, the city or the metropolis or is not necessarily, an obsession. Mm-hmm. With landscape. I mean, with some landscape architects, at least. Back in the 90s, when I was writing these pieces, every architect had a theory on the city. I mean, they had they were city theory sellers. Really everywhere. So they were painful, really. And so I thought it was kind of an advantage not to come up with an urban theory for justifying anything, or doing things. It's true that you could say their tradition in landscape design bring them back not so much into the city, which they contributed to extend. Champs-Élysées is Le Nôtre stuff.
100%.
But if you think of the let's say the Italian Renaissance garden. I know it doesn't mean anything to say it like that, but where were they? So where are the big things? So it's Villa Medici in Fiesole. It's these suburbia. In a way, it's the tradition of the suburban villa. In a way, the Roman one. Frascati is the same. If you go now to the French Jardin à la Française, etc. Mm-hmm. Like it's the suburbs of Paris, basically. The Le Nôtre with the dream team of the classical garden, it's Saint-Cloud, Versailles, etc. And for the picturesque, the English picturesque is a bit further. It's different, but it's really not to the city proper that they're in a way references are. They are next door. Mm-hmm. So where the city actually progressed was there. So they in a way they prepared the terrain for that. But so that's also one of the reasons to call that thing sub-urbanism. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a place where you didn't come just with a program like that. It's a different thing. Yeah.
And I'm glad that you're mentioning that these were the places where the development was going, because of course there comes a bit the dark side of my question, whether you don't see those projects as projects of colonization somehow, in a way, with the negative aspects, but also with some interesting maybe positive aspects.
Of course, there is behind those projects an architecture of domination, literally, or colonization, if you can say that. Where you kind of perspectively align the castle, the Hortus, the Ager, and the Saltus, and and by the way, you start the process of the rural exodus, when they built, for instance, Vaux-le-Vicomte, it's 3 villages that they razed to the ground. That's really a kind of laboratory of the not exactly the enclosure, but the expulsion of countrysides there. So yeah, in the exhibition we have a whole section on this, on the architecture of domination.
I mean, maybe it's a much more simple question, but when you explain at the start of the book the choice of term suburbanism to describe this practice, you mentioned that it's the core of the project is to reveal the site. Why is it so essential that the site is expressed in the program? Even though I agree, but like, why is it such a...
Reveal is maybe too simple or too literal a word, but it's too. I love in French we have a very good word, a verb, which is réussir, which means réussir.
Achieve?
Yeah, achieve. But in réussir, it's like a make re-emerge, réussite. Re-express in a way, and protect and maintain and make prosper in a way. So it means to transform it. It means to do many things, but to make it endure. So of course today it's almost an environmental agenda in a way.
It totally is an environmental agenda, and I think what is very fertile, I think, of your work is that on the one hand there's definitely that attention to the environment, obviously, which again is also your job. Again, I think it's fantastic to think that there can be a chair for the history and theory of the environment. And on the other hand, of course, also an attention towards culture and history in general. And so I would like to ask you a question that is maybe, I don't know if it's a bit of a first world problem, because it's more like a theoretical question, but it's something that I find deeply fascinating. This is the role of analogical thought in many of the examples actually that you show us.
Analogy.
The idea of analogy in general that returns in several of your examples. I think it's maybe the most clear in the case of Smithson, through 2 things, I would say. The idea of the logical picture that you explained already earlier, that is definitely an analogical mechanism where we translate basically a site into an object or into an image. But also I think that there is another moment in which actually the story of Smithson that you show us, to me, powerfully triggers actually a moment of reflection on the idea of analogy. That is this picture of his little museum that his father built him, that is more than a museum, I would say, is a Wunderkammer, right? Yeah. Because it's like a cabinet of curiosities, where the things that are in there don't have necessarily a value that is universal. It's a value that is incredibly specific to the person or to the people who curated them. And in a way, it's a little space that it's meant to analogically reconstruct his own view of the world. In a way, it's his map of the world, to go back to the question of maps that sometimes can be also deeply personal, right? I've always been fascinated by the shift from Wunderkammer to museums, because of course Wunderkammers were all based on the idea of analogy. They were based on the idea of analogically reconstructing the cosmos in a space. They were very idiosyncratic, so if you lose the key, maybe someone else actually might not be able to interpret that. And of course, obviously, when we had to make that intersubjective, and that happened first, right, around the corner at the British Museum, we had to start to articulate a different way to curate objects, memories, of course, to translate that into history, into something systematized. And we completely lost that ability to think analogically. That, of course, we can think it's dangerous because up to a certain degree is not intersubjective, or it's difficult to render intersubjective, but it's also incredibly fertile, as a lot of your examples actually show us. The ability to translate an idea into another idea, into an object, in fact. So no ideas but new things, as you mentioned earlier, right? Not to proceed from the abstract to the abstract, but to continuously jump from the abstract to the concrete, to the abstract to the concrete. So I was wondering what you think we lost, and if it is really lost, actually, this idea of working through analogy rather than through, the modern framework that completely discards this possibility.
And I never asked myself that question that way. So I don't know. I'm actually thinking, and I would...
Because I don't. My provisional answer is that we lost somewhere an ability to read, rework, reinterpret form. Because of course, analogy continuously retranslating the abstract and the concrete one into the other has also an incredible facility to work with forms in general rather than with abstractions. And I still think that as a designer, it's a great tool to have. It's also in a lot of the projects that you showed us, like the case of Descombes or many of the gardens that you showed us, where there isn't like a literal translation, but it's a kind of analogical connection,
right,
or an amplification of a feeling or of a memory, as you explain it in the book very often. And I found that, of course, maybe it's not on the same level of urgency as the ecological problem that we are going through. But I think what I love of your work is that there's always this double urgency. There's a very pragmatic urgency that is, again, environmental and so on and so forth, but there's also a cultural urgency that goes to this ability to recuperate fully our capacity to think through space and time.
Yeah, I would phrase it a bit differently. But yes, I think it's important to combine the energy maybe that we lose sometime in art, but we keep it, but that we transform the notion of art. Art, has become the culture of exhibitions today, when the really important thing to do is to make again architecture an art, make hope an art, make agriculture an art. I mean, for me, agriculture, architecture are more arts than anything else.
Exactly.
They are fundamental arts. That's what we try to. We did a project with a friend we lost, for instance, to bring for the next Biennale in Venice, where there will be no pavilion, French pavilion. Hope that's great because it's in under construction next year. So we said, fantastic. So we called our project une ambassade paysanne, a peasant embassy, to bring the peasant agriculture today at the heart of the Biennale, on a kind of radeau de la Medusa raft, because, so our cousin, which is agriculture, the cousin of architecture, they appear together, they are like completely fundamentally linked to one another, basically, and they divorce, to bring their lost cousin, at the heart of your Biennale, because this is the subject now. Today. I mean, I don't know. We lost.
That's really wonderful. We are almost at the end of our time, but I would invite the audience. If you have questions to engage in the conversation, because I could go on. And I guess both of us could go on with many, many other questions, but it's interesting to hear from you.
This isn't really a question, it's a celebration. I know nothing about you. I read something, I was invited this evening and I read something and I came. So, in a way, the way you speak, which you do incredibly well, I've never actually heard a Frenchman move across langage so eloquently and visit.
No song.
Well, I mean it sincerely. I mean, it's a really special thing. And I suppose there was a kind of humility at the beginning where you were very funny about I didn't quite get round to this, or I didn't finish this, or I didn't pursue it. A kind of actually just human fallibility, which I think for students is perhaps the most important thing to know about, to know that everything isn't a tidy project. It doesn't have a tidy beginning, it doesn't have a tidy middle, and it doesn't have a tidy end. And there was something about the way that you offered that was incredibly generous. And for me, who doesn't finish anything, was very
reassuring.
Was very reassuring, but also very funny. And the other thing is, I hope tonight is recorded because you use language very particularly. And I'll finish my compliment by just saying I remember once looking up palimpsest as an etymology and discovering that the al sound comes from sanding. And it's the grinding, removing noise, which of course then jumps to map making and all forms of flatness and shininess. And anyway, the day I discovered that meant a lot to me. So I'm just, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Shall we drink?
Yeah, we do have drinks in the South Jury Room, so when you're ready, we can continue the conversation more informally. Yeah?
Thank you.